Forge for Halo Infinite is here, and designing scenes for Forge is something that's been here before, but now we have scripting, and I'm going to teach you how to do this in some easy steps. So come along me into the world of Halo scripting. Right, you've loaded into Forge, and let's think about what we can do. There's obviously, we can create weapons and change them around, as probably seen all over, but let's do something really simple. Let's build a door. So I've got here my nice box with a lovely door frame, and so I think I'm going to put a door in front of this and then have a button to activate to allow you in and possibly out. So where to start? Obviously we need to create our door. I'm going to open the object browser and scroll down to structures and then find doors. And then I get to choose what kind of door I want to put in. So I could put in a welded gate, a wooden gate, heavy door, or a Spartan door, all sorts of different doors. But I'm going to choose the Spartan door because that's sort of, what we're trying to create. Now, it does look a bit puny in that, but obviously you can change and make whatever object you want. I'm just choosing the door because it's easier. Right, so we got our door here. And what else we need is a button. And buttons are found under the tab Gameplay, under things such as scripting. So we've got our invisible switch, and then we've got our actual physical switches, which you've probably seen throughout the Halo Infinite campaign and all over the place. So I'm just going to choose a nice terminal. I'm going to go for this one, make it on brand, and I'm just going to rotate it round so that it's facing. Right, so we've got two objects, but now we need to create what is known as a scripting brain. And that's once again found in the scripting tab of your object browser. And let's bring in this script brain. This is essentially a container that holds all your code that you're going to write so that the game can then run it. And I'm just going to place it nearby just to give me an idea of where brain, because you might have lots of different brains doing different things, and so just be organized, just keep it there. And of course you can change the name of it in the object browser, and you can write, say, description or sort of, this brain is opening door script brain or whatever, but we're just going to leave it for the same name because we've only got one script brain. It's not going to be terribly difficult. But before we enter the script brain, we need to do two things. We need to change the door properties to enable the door to be scriptable. So obviously we select the door, go into our object properties, which is the next tab along from the object browser, and here we've got a list of all the properties of that door, from its name to its position to rotation and to its color things. Now I'm going to go down into object mode and see it's got this thing called static. So static objects are scalable, resizable, and non-scriptable. Whereas if I scroll one to the right, dynamic objects aren't scalable, but are scriptable. So we need to make this object dynamic. And that's just simply going one to the right and making it, selecting dynamic. Now the next object is called physics, and that determines how the object interacts. And then the lovely help bar tells you what things mean. So we've got fixed. So fixed objects basically collide with other objects, but they don't move. We've got phased objects, those phase through objects. So that's no clipping essentially. And then we've got normal, which is a fixed object but reacts to the physics of the world, such as if you've got low gravity or anything like that. So in this case, we've got a door, and let's say we want it to go sideways, like a sliding door. Well, that means it needs to phase through other objects. So we hit phased, and now our door is correctly assigned the properties it needs to be a door. Right, now we head into the scripting brain. So we click on it, select it, and then pressing and holding Y on a controller, you bring up this menu. You go select up, and that goes into the node graph, and release, and now you're into this blank canvas. This is where the scripting happens. And if I just scroll out, you can see a red box forms around it. That's the entire size of your container. So let's start off with working out what do we want to do. So we want to run up to the button and interact with that button, and then the door opens. Now, following that chain of logic, graph node, or the scripting brain, needs to know is the objects we are playing with. So we now actually hop out of the script brain and deselect the script brain to select the objects we want to play with. And that's the switch and the door. We then, without holding the script brain, we then press and hold Y and go back into scripting graph node. We've taken this back, and then we press Y again, and we add this thing called an object reference. And I'm just going to move myself in there. And what that's done is an object reference, so the script brain knows what objects we are playing with. So here is the scriptable switch, and here is the USC door. So I'm just going to move those by zooming out, move them to the side, and move them one on top of the other, just to create some space so we can then start building the rest of it. Right. Now, we need to go and look at what node we're looking for. We want the button to do something. We want to interact with the button and then it to do something. So we think, well, what's that meaning? So, like the object browser, inside the node, the script brain, you now have the node browser. These are all the nodes that you can use to program your scripts. And what we have here is a lovely thing at the bottom, at the top, called events. An event is something that the game checks. So a gun is fired, a grenade is thrown, you enter a vehicle. Those are all what we call events. And so interacting with a button, they've determined that to be an event. Now that node is found in custom events, and it's on object interacted with. So I go down to on object interacted. And here we've got it spawned in, and we've got some series of dots and triangles and I say a rhombus, it might be a square to look at. So I'm just going to zoom in and just show what we can do. Right, so this is looking for an object, and these are object references. So what we can do is draw those in. Now this node can only look at one object, so we can't draw two lines in. So we can only take one object at a time, which means if we want two object references or two object interacted, we're going to need two enter, but we're not, because we've already got one switch. And what we want to be interacted with is, of course, the switch. So let me just remove that. And then using a controller, we hover over the circle, we right bumper it, which starts the drawing of a line, and then we draw it to the object interacted, and it snaps to its dot. and then we right bumper again to connect it. Now, as you saw, some of the titles changed. So if I just clear that connection by pressing Y on that dot and scrolling from the menu, it says object entry and it doesn't understand what's being done. Whereas if I select it, it now sort of saying, object reference is this one. So when I go to the UNC script, it's going to allow me to interact with it. And then it says interacting player. Well, we can say, is it enemy team or is it a neutral team? It's all sort of a next step. But can you see now we've got this thing, triangle. This is actually what's flowing the program code. Essentially, it's the next line or go to next line of code. But because we're not writing code, we're visually scripting it, it's more like your code is actually a flow path or a flow chart in a sense. So now we've got object interacted. Now we need to actually get to do something. We need to do what we're trying to do. So in this case, we want the door to slide one way or the other. So let's go into our Node browser and just see what we've got. Now, at the bottom here, now middle, we've got this thing called objects. These are the properties of a node of an object. We've got object transform. And transform basically means move or scale or rotate, or essentially it's changing the position of an object but not changing the properties of an object. So inside that you can get all sorts of the variables about sort of whether the object, the direction it's forward or its velocity, all sorts of things. But essentially we just want to move the object. Now in programming terms, move is what we call translate, because you're going from one place to another, as opposed to move object to transform, which essentially is moving an object to another object. And that's, we don't have another object to move to. So let's move our translate object to points. Now, in Halo Infinite, they use global positioning. So there's an origin in the middle and everything related to that. So essentially, we're moving it from its coordinates to another set of coordinates. That's fair enough. So on interacted, we select the diamond and we go and press the diamond on the translate object to points. And that then says the chain of events going, when you interact with the switch, you then translate the object. Now this node is now asking questions about what object am I transporting? Where is it going to? Its position. How long, as in, does the translation happen? As in duration in seconds. And then movement curves. Now that's sort of, you've probably heard all these things in PowerPoint where you can ease things in and they get acceleration or not. And that's just a way of showing if things are moving quickly, then speeding up. But that's not too complicated. We'll go through that later. So let's deal with the first thing. This node wants to know, what is it moving? And that is simple. We want to move the UNC door. So I connect it together. Now it's covering over these nodes. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to move them like we move prop objects. I'm just going to move it down just to make things neater and clearer. So it's got its position. It's got its object. Now we need to work on the position. Now, unfortunately, the object reference doesn't know where it is. It just knows that it's defining this object. However, if I go in, I could say, get the object's position. So, and that is taking whatever object we define and it's getting its position. And that's great. So we go over to select them together. And now we're saying this object, get its position. Those coordinates which are inside the game which you can read. And let's do something with them. Now, if I just connect them together, I'm saying get the object position and then translate the object to the object's position. And that doesn't seem to work because obviously that's not moving anything at all. So I'm just going to go and select that node or that point and just clear it because that's not what we want to happen. We want to move it sideways. And that is an X or Y direction. And we'll choose and we'll work it out. So moving an object, that's a vector, or the game treats movement as a vector because it's going from one point to another. And that path is determined by a vector. So this is where we need to basically define a vector. Now, vectors are basic variables because they're just numbers or coordinates. And there's no vectors or stuff inside the object transform. So we've got to go hunting where it might be. Now, small hint, it actually lives in the basic variables. These are just very basic. I'll just change the things. So I go in and list all the basic variables we've got in the game. You know, such as grenade type or those things, number, and sort of what an object reference is, which is a basic, At the bottom here, we have vector 3. Now, that's not saying there's a vector 1 or 2. That's saying in 3D space, you've got 3 vectors, which is what is going to output. There we go. So just moving across, just to get everything lined up. So we can put in our vector. So let's just go into the object, pressing X, and then pressing right bumper to go into the node properties, very similar to going to object properties. And here we can list the actual values of all the things and saying the vector output is calculated. That means you putting an input, it will just do the maths for you, which is useful. You're not having to program how a vector works. So let's just change in here. Let's just change the X to a 10. Just so we can sort of work out which way we need to move an object. So now I could just take this vector and move it to this object. And it would work. But the problem here is, see, it doesn't know where, it says it moved the object by 10, but it doesn't know where it started from, which is where we get the object position. Because that tells us where we're from, and now we want to move it X by 10. But how do you combine nodes? Well, since they're vectors, and this is a position vector, and this is also a vector, could we not add vectors together? So coming back out into our node browser, we have this tab called Maths. Now, don't be afraid. It's not like normal maths. It's all done for you. You just got to tell it essentially the brain to actually do the maths. It's like doing a task as opposed to you physically doing the maths. And understandable, we've got lots of different ways of doing maths. And here is add vectors. And there we see, brings in a node, and it's got an A and a B and a result. So we connect our get position node to A, and our vectors 3 to B. And in theory, that's adding get object position and vectors 3 together. And then we connect that to object position. So now in theory, that's adding, moving the object 10 in the X direction. Now, it doesn't know how long, but we can change that by going to the object settings after you've selected it, and we can say, let's say it takes 5 seconds. Now, movement curve, we're just going to go 1 and just select linear. That's the default. That's just moving very linearly in a straight line between those 2 points. Right. once you've done this, this is your first script you've done. And then we hop out of the no brain by pressing B. And then in theory, if we go in from to play mode, which is by holding the square buttons, the script brain is hopefully successful by not getting an error message in the global messaging, which would take place on the right hand side of the screen underneath where it says play mode and return to monitor. So we go across, and I'm just going to sprint over to find our door. And now I'm going to walk up to it, and there it says activate. So I'm going to press and hold X, and there we go. Our door is sliding, and we could enter. Now, if you were thinking for the door to go back, we haven't programmed that. So let's go back in and program it going back. Now, back in the script brain, or the node graph of the script brain, we need to find where this wait node is. And that can be found in logic. Not the most logical place for it to be called, but that's where sort of the thinking of the node brain would take place. So we've got all these sort of lovely compare and all these things. And down here at the bottom, we've got wait for n seconds. So we spawn n, and as we can see, it's got some diamonds. And essentially, like the flow path, we've now opened the door, and now we want to wait some seconds. And now I'm going to press X to load the object properties, and I'm going to type in 5 seconds just to make everything nice and round. And now we wait 5 seconds. To do what? Move backwards, or just you could get it to move backwards, or we could just say just go back there. So for first things, let's just say, well, I just want to go back. Don't really care. And that's under object transform. You might find that inside there was a reset object, and that resets all the properties back to where it was when you started the game up, or started the gameplay. And so here we can reset by putting in and connecting the two triangles together. And now it needs to know what needs to reset. And that's simple. We want it to reset this UNSC door. I'm just going to take this node, just move it up. And I'm going to take this one, move that one up, just so the line's clearer. So now we can see that this, at the end of the chain, is resetting this door. So let's see if it works. So we hop out of this and back into play mode and run to the door, activating the door. It slides along, and then we count for 5 seconds, 4, 5, and it slides straight back. Good. So in theory, if we were in the room, doing things, blah, 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 killing all the baddies, we're now in, and now effectively we're stuck. But that might be what you want to do, create a small room, because there's a passageway. However, let's say if we want to go back to the other side. Now, what we can do is essentially we could take that object and this script brain and duplicate it. There we go. And I'm just going to move them not through each other, like so. Could turn through the room and just rotate by 180 degrees, and then move them right, and there we go. So that's duplicated our entire script brain, which is why it's called a container, because if we go into the script brain by selecting it and actually selecting it and pressing Y, you'll see it's exactly the same as the other one, which is where naming the script brains helps. But one of the major things you might see is if I interact with this one and then interact with this button again, the door is going to continually go on. So how do you fix that? How do you stop the button from being pressed whilst the door moving? Well, this is where an advanced programming term is called, which is what we know as Boolean logic. This is essentially returning true and false questions such as, is the door opening, or is the door closing, or is the door closed? And that returns whether the value is true or false. So I'll just get rid of that button and that script because we're going to duplicate it later. I'm just going to delete them to work on this script. And that's so we can duplicate it later instead of having an old version. So, good path. And we could choose to move back and slide it back, which is another translate to object. But let's not panic about that. So first off, we need to define two questions. If the door is opening, don't do anything. And is the door closed? Because obviously if it's closed, we want it to slide open. But if it's open, we want it to slide closed. So let's just deal with that first question, dealing with if the door is opening, do nothing. So we come out of this and we come into this. I think what we're trying to change, and the door opening, is the door opening the question? Well, that's a question we're answering, so that's more like a variable. And so we come down here and we don't go into basic variables, we go into advanced variables. And that's where we declare some value types or value of what we want to set. And we want to declare a Boolean variable. Right? And that's very simple. So going into the object properties, I'm just going to type in is opening. Apart from my can't quite spell. So that's created the value is opening. And really its initial value of this statement should be false because it isn't opening. The door should spawn closed. And now it's scope. Now there are three variables in this. You've got global. That means it's for the entire map. Can read this variable and just check if things are open and closed. You might want to do this if you're declaring a variable for the entire map where you've got loads of doors. Or local, where it's just inside this brain. Or per object, which means anything tied to that object makes it gives a variable. So that's what we're looking for, only detecting that object. So just to make things easier, we just go for global. That means everything can access it. And there we've defined our first variable. The first question is the door opening. The next question we asked was, is the door closed? And once again, we could declare a Boolean variable, or we could simply duplicate it and just type in is closed. And now we say, well, the initial value of that should be true because the door should spawn closed. Having declared our Boolean variables, we now need to start putting them inside our chain that goes through this way. And so for the code to know what the variable is, there's the value of that statement, he needs to get the variable. So we load up our node browser and we go back down to variables advanced. And inside we see all things once again, and then we want to get our Boolean variable. I'm just going to move it along here. And back into the node properties of that selected node, we can then type some things in, such as the identifier. Now, the question we're checking is the door opening? So this variable we're checking for is opening. And you need to make sure they're spelt correctly, because otherwise they're looking for two different variables. And then once again, scope, we're going to put as global, and object, if it was an object, scope, need to define that. But since it's global, don't need to panic. Right. So now that we've got what the variable is, we need to ask the question, is the door opening? And that is what we call a true or false statement. If true, don't do anything. If false, open the door. Now the game calls it not a if statement or a true false statement. It calls it something different. And that can be seen under the logic tab, and they call it a branch. And you can sort of understand why, because it is branching two statements. So we bring the statement in and we say, right, we come down here and just clear that out, because we say the on object asks the question, is the branch, is the variable we've just set true or false? So currently we said if the door is opening, you don't want to do anything. And if you don't draw anything or connect to anything, it treats it as terminated. Now we need to get the next Boolean variable, which of course is closed, and we need to insert that into a path. Now we've got that currently selected, so let's just deselect them all, and I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to duplicate it instead of finding it in the menu, because it's the same item, and I'm just going to drop it in past this branch, and now it says if it's opening. So we go into the node properties and we just change this to is closed. And once again, we unselect, we now select the branch and duplicate that, because that's asking our true and false question. So just link it up the same way. Now, unlike here, we're asking on the object, if it is opening, don't do anything. If it's false, as it is not opening, then we want to do something. So we actually need to link up this to this question before we interact with our object. Now this leads into the next question or statement of this single chain here of, do we need it twice? Because of course, and the answer is we do need it twice, and that's so we can say if it's opening, open, if it's closed, close it. So we'll just duplicate all that, and that will duplicate also the connections. And then for these ones, I'm just going to take these guys up like so. So essentially we've got two paths. So now, unfortunately, we've got our variables, but now we need to sort of change them to represent what we've just done. And that is essentially going and setting those variables to be true or false. And let's start with the first thing. So if the door is opening and we press the button and opened it, then we need to set the variable to open, in which case then that passes through the termination upon interaction. So go into here and we scroll all the way bottom to set Boolean variable. And we come in here into the node properties and we say is opening. And then we want to say now it's true, because we've said it's now gone from is false. And I'm just going to change this correctly. And I'm just going, if the door is now closed, we now want to open the door. And by changing the value of the door is opening Boolean, so now the next time we press the button, it won't do anything. And we do need to do that the same for the false, because of course, for the same reason again. Now, essentially, we need to now set what variable is where, because we've just changed the variable is closed or is open, and the door doesn't know which way it's going. So for if the door is true and it's closed, then we want to open it, which of course is this thing. But the button doesn't know whether it's open or closed again. So we need to declare that and set that. So we take our set Boolean variable, we duplicate it, and we just change its properties and check is closed. And since we're just opening it, we've actually now changed it to false. And we just link that together. Now, here's the next best bit. We can then take the statement, now that we've set all the variables, we can now finally link that to our translate object, because that's now moving the object. Now, this wait stuff, well, since we're opening and closing a door where the button is pressed, we can just get rid of these ones, because we don't need them anymore, because it will remain open and closed depending on the button state. So we can get rid of those by deleting them. We can get rid of those by deleting them. Now the door is open, because we've just opened it. We now need to set the variable of is it opening to false, because now it's not moving. So once again, we select this mode, just duplicate it, and we branch it up here, and just link them together. It's the same, but all we now need to do is make that false again, because that's now resetting the variable for the next time you open and close the script. And once again, we can select this one, duplicate it for our other branch, and instead of saying is the door closed being false, now this is saying if false, open the door, and therefore we need to make the statement of is closed being true and connect them together. Grab this object one, drag through, go to our diamond, and plonk it in. Now this has forgotten the object, so making sure that the object is this one, and the position is the result of these two. Except, is it? Because we want to move backwards, we actually need to subtract the vectors, not add them. So in our object nodes, we go back to maths, and we come down nearer the bottom to where it says subtract vectors. And we just essentially set them in. And so remembering that this went to B, this position went to A, and then that's the result here of our position, like so. And we can see here that we didn't set the value of is true, because that's now following that statement there, on the lower chain. So let's just duplicate that through. And that once again is the same statement. Good. Now, once again, you've got to work out the true and false statements and paths they're going through. If a door is closed, then its opening is true. Then, see, I still think I'm right in my... With that done, let's go in and just test it out in play mode. So just run around this side of the barricade this time, spice things up. And come to our button, and the door opens. Come back to our button, and the door closes. And now the door goes back and forth after we press it. Now we can duplicate the brain and the button, and we can move it to the other side, and now we can just check that that would work on the other side. So now all buttons with the same node brain will now move the door the same direction. So that's your first script made in Halo Infinite's Forge. I cannot wait to see what you do with this. And if you would like access to the script brain, the script we just wrote, just so you can essentially check and see if you've got anything wrong, I'm going to make it available in my file area on Halo Waypoint, and the link to that can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I cannot wait for what you create. And in the next video, I'm going to show you how to make a secret hideaway that only you can get into.